I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the second IUFoST Global Food Summit dedicated to strategies and actions for sustainability of food systems. I do apologize for not having been able to join you in person, and I'm hopeful that this intervention will introduce a number of discussion points around the impact of the current pandemic on food regulatory systems and initiate a discussion on the requirements of resilience of such systems in the medium and longer term. Like any organization, food regulators were impacted by the current COVID-19 pandemic. And as work organizations, they needed to activate their business continuity plans and needed to adapt their operations to the new realities of a work environment, enabling, for example, remote working, but also adapting some functions that were not necessarily traditionally carried out remotely, such as audits and inspections. As competent authorities as well, food regulators needed to preserve the integrity of their regulatory mandate and also to address one of the key questions related to the potential introduction of new hazards as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at some of the enablers that helped food regulators address the current period of the pandemic, international collaboration was absolutely key, and the reliance on networks of food regulators was instrumental in providing the advice and the information in a timely fashion. FAO and WHO, through the International Food Safety Regulatory Network, allowed to provide a number of guidance documents very early on, since the beginning of the pandemic, when it was declared by the World Health Organization. And these sources of information, the guidance documents, were absolutely key in helping regulators address the situation. Other forums, such as the heads of foods agencies forums that was triggered recently by the regulators of Saudi Arabia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Republic of Ireland, allowed also to offer a forum of information exchange and to learn from regulators' experiences and provide other opportunities of collaboration. Now, three areas of priorities were the focus of food competent authorities during the current period. First, address emerging risks during the pandemic and answer a key question whether COVID-19 was a foodborne hazard that needed to be addressed. And thankfully, in this regard, that was not the case. The issue was mainly a food security risk. COVID-19 is not a foodborne hazard, and the focus turned to ensuring that the disruption in food production operations, how these disruptions could be prevented and potentially mitigated in order to not have interruptions of food supply that could further threaten food security. And of course, as competent authorities, food regulators needed to maintain the integrity of their food regulatory functions through the relevant adaptations. So again, in the context of this issue, thankfully, COVID-19 is not a foodborne hazard, and essentially very early on, risk assessments were able to confirm that food, including packaging, was an unlikely source to contribute to the transmission. And it was very important that this fact be conveyed in a timely fashion and be disseminated such that misinformation that was circulating as a result of social media posting was debunked very quickly. And the ability to review scientific information and to issue those scientific opinions in a timely fashion was one of the key priorities that food regulatory agencies needed to attend to during this period. And being able to be relevant in the context of so many sources of information was also very important. The second priority was to contribute to maintaining the food supply and contribute to mitigating the disruption of the supply chains. And the guidance that was issued by FAO WHO was a key source of information that a number of regulators used to issue their own guidance documents for their food production sectors, and that needed to be adapted, of course, to the realities of each country and each region. The priority was here to protect workers and to adapt the work environment for certain food and agri-food production sectors to the realities of physical distancing and also work reorganization. Making sure that key messages around hand washing, the use of protected equipment, the potential contamination of surfaces, these messages needed to be conveyed and reiterated in a number of food production establishments. The third priority was to maintain the integrity of food regulatory functions. And here again, food regulatory agencies identified the importance of relying on emergency response plans and on the availability of a business continuity plans. There was a need to look at food regulatory functions and prioritize them. Using a risk-based approach was key in this regard. Being able to maintain the operations where either the safety or the security of the food supply was potentially impacted, those were the areas of priorities that needed to be attended to. Looking at inducing minimum interruptions, but at the same time, maintaining the integrity of the regulatory function. So some adaptations were looked at, for example, either postponing license renewals or using digitalization. So the reliance upon remote delivery of a number of functions was actually key. And in some instances, some functions related to the inspection of food imports needed to be both prioritized but also adapted to ensure that there was minimum disruption to the supply chain. When food regulators, or at least some of the food regulators, particularly those that were involved in the Heads of Agencies Forum, were surveyed as to the challenges that they experienced over the past period, this is a snapshot of what they have conveyed. Despite the reliance on technology platforms, well, a number of competent authorities witnessed some of the difficulties of the limited availability of such means of communication in some parts of the country. This is not even everywhere. The ability to conduct certain functions like audits, like food safety investigations of incidents were impacted, and they needed to be adapted in the context of the pandemic. The ability also to respond in a timely fashion to misinformation that was growing, particularly in social media networks, and being able actually to debunk this information with relevance and being able to be heard was a major concern that was expressed by a number of regulators. And in some instances, the lack of consensus or the differences of opinions or positions or regulatory decisions between a number of countries was a factor of confusion and sometimes a challenge that needed to be attended to. And some countries that were and are dependent in their supply on food import, of course, needed to make sure that they adapted their supply chains, but also adapted their food regulatory operations, making sure that food import clearance was fast-tracked and applying that risk-based lens to ensure that, one, there would not be an undue weight at the points of entry, but at the same time being able to inspect and to audit those consignments that may have represented the highest level of risk. There continues to be challenges because the pandemic is still with us, and there were some recent reports about the detection of the virus in a number of frozen food products. These results are still being assessed and actually looking at their relevance from a food safety standpoint. And there is a need to continue to resist to the temptation of imposing technical barriers to trade that would not be scientifically founded, and making sure that the supply chains continue to be maintained. Also, discussing the ability of food regulatory functions to withstand shocks, such as the one of an ongoing pandemic, is actually now an ongoing area of discussion amongst key regulators. Being able to prioritize the food regulatory functions, such as the safety of the products is maintained, making sure that disruption of supply chains is limited, mitigated, and prevented to the extent possible. Being able also to ensure that the modes of delivery of food regulatory functions are adapted such that they respond or they are able to withstand situations like a pandemic, and that this adaptation is rapid, but it's also tailored to the environment, tailored to the region, the country, and the realities of the food production system. And finally, everybody agrees on the importance of international collaboration and of the availability of networks both at the regional level but also at the global level. And here again, the instrumental role played by networks such as IUFoST and the guidance by the international organizations was identified as key in helping regulators around the globe to be able to address this issue. I hope that these points will serve as elements of discussion for the remainder of the meeting. And again, thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute.